Memoirs of a Dad, narrated by Malc, Cowle, Chapter 10. Now then, where were we? Right, Tom had just commenced the autumn term at Greenham Primary, and on the following Sunday he celebrated his 5th birthday, which, being a very special occasion, he spent with his mother. The following Easter of 1987, we again visited Alstonfield, and attended the second Bluegrass Festival in Edale at Netherallabrook Farm at the end of May. For our summer holidays, we decided on a romantic journey to the Isle of Skye, and determined we should cycle all the way there and back, apart from the ferry trips to over the sea to and from Skye. We set out on the Saturday. Our journey took us through Bury and Ramsbottom to Aslington in Rossendale, from where we headed out to Clitheroe with its ruined Norman castle, via Accrington and Clayton-le-Moors. Having completed 34 miles, we had a break in a suitable cafe, and then continued through Gisburn to Long Preston, following the course of the River Ribble to settle in Ribblesdale. Eventually we found a campsite on the edge of the town, both of us by now tired but happy. 54 hard miles in our legs, and some beautiful country ahead of us. The weather had been fine all day, and the weather forecaster made it clear this situation would continue. The next day we continued up Ribblesdale, a magnificent valley with 3 of England's most impressive peaks dominating the scene, namely Pennygent to the east, Ingleborough to the west, and Whernside dominating Ribble Head to the northwest. After the climb up to Ribble Head, we stopped for refreshment at the Station Hotel, the only pub I know that claims a loo with a view, the gents' toilet looking out over one of Britain's railway architectural wonders, the Ribblehead Viaduct, and the wild Blee Moor that it crosses at this point. From here we set off towards Oars, but soon turned off the main road to head down the steep and twisting descent into Dentdale, and a fairly easy ride to Sebber. Here we stopped for refreshment once again in one of Sebber's many tea shops. Another long climb lay ahead of us before we could once more descend into the aptly named Eden Valley, which would take us to Kirby Stephen and from there to Appleby, where I planned to camp once again, knowing that if we continued at the pace we had managed up to that point, we could cross the border into Scotland the next day. Not least because the River Eden is unique amongst English rivers. It flows north, eventually accessing the coast at Carlisle, which meant our route to that old garrison town would be mainly downhill. We did achieve our intended destination, but at a price. The weather forecast had been correct. It was sunny. In fact, it was red hot, and we were undertaking our most serious climbing at the hottest time of the day. By the time we reached Appleby, I was really suffering, and decided we should have a rest day. Once again, Tom did not object. We'd completed a further 52 miles of our journey that day. Monday morning, and both of us awoke refreshed, and I made an alteration to the previous night's decision. We would take it easy, but we would still be in Scotland by that evening. I simply decided we would cheat by treating ourselves to a ride on the historic Settle to Carlisle Railway. This line had just survived the second attempt to close it down. It had been one of the mainline routes Beeching had recommended for closure in the early 1960s, and the Thatcher government had decided to attempt what Beeching failed to achieve. Unfortunately for her, and thankfully for the British economy, the mass protests organised by a combination of local residents, the Friends of the Settle Carlisle Line, and the Ramblers Association nationally, reduced her short-sighted plans to naught. When I say thankfully for the British economy, I am not being misleading. The Settle to Carlisle Railway was originally built by the Midland Railway Company as part of its mainline route from London to Scotland, and covers a spectacular and rugged area of the Pennines. 2 decades after our journey, in the period between 2006 and 2010, large amounts of long overdue capital was expended on the line, renewing track and strengthening its many viaducts and tunnels. The reason for this capital outlay was simple. Neither the West Coast Main Line nor the East Coast Line have the capacity any longer to cope with large amounts of freight traffic. The Settle to Carlisle did have the capacity, and provision had to be made to transport an extra 13 heavy freight trains a day. 13 doesn't sound a great number, but each of those trains can carry a payload of 2,000 metric tons, which means that each train replaces some 64 lorries. Do the sums. 13 trains a day is 830 lorry loads a day, or 5,824 lorry loads a week, or 302,848 lorry loads a year. Moreover, railways carry freight at a third of the cost of transportation by road. Why, I hear you ask, were they needed, leaving aside the question of replacing lorries on our congested roads? The answer is because we need to transport imported coal from the Scottish port of Unterston to feed the power stations in South Yorkshire and the Trent Valley. Moreover, the reason that coal has to be taken to those power stations, which are situated in two of the largest coal-bearing areas of England, is because the ever-so-clever Thatcher government had closed down the pits in the 1980s and early 1990s, and the obvious and by far the cheapest way to transport the imported substitute is on the railway she had also tried to close. The stupidity of British transport and economic policy over the years, and its preference for road over rail, is also illustrated by the situation whereby Cornwall became isolated from the country's rail network because of the destruction of the railway line at Dawlish by the forces of nature towards the end of 2013. It is now scheduled for reopening in April this year. Examine a pre-beaching map of the railway system and you will find 4 different routes from Devon into Cornwall, all of which were closed from the 1960s onwards. That's enough ranting for one chapter, I hear you say. I told you it was a bad habit I have. To continue with our journey, and to cut a long story short, we took the train from Appleby and Westmoreland and enjoyed the 30-mile journey to Carlisle in comfort. After wandering around the town, we headed north to Longtown, avoiding the busy coast road, and then headed west through Gretna to Annan, where we pitched our tent on the town's municipal campsite, a mere 22.5 miles having been undertaken by bike. That first night in Scotland, it began to rain, and both Tom and I welcomed it. The next day, Wednesday, we set out for the ancient town and port of Dumfries, where Robert Burns had held down the job of Customs and Excise officer for a brief period, and where he had died at the age of 37. The day remained dry, but there was a cooling breeze blowing gently off the Solway Firth. From here we forsook the coast to head inland to New Galloway, where we discovered a simple campsite near a pub, which happened to have a ceilidh on that very evening. Thus we not only added another 44 miles to our legs, but enjoyed a musical treat before retiring to our sleeping bags and a good night's sleep. By that time I'd worked out the outlines of our route for the next few days. Generally speaking, when planning most long-distance cycle tours, I tried to avoid cities and even large towns wherever possible, and the city I wanted to avoid on our journey to Skye was Glasgow and its environs. Consequently, my plan was to head through Galloway into Ayrshire and down to the coast at Ardrossan, keeping to the east of Ayr and Prestwick Airport. From Ardrossan we would get a ferry to the Isle of Arran and enjoy a couple of days exploring that island, before boarding another ferry to Kintyre on the mainland to the west of the Firth of Clyde. From there we would travel to Oban and the Western Highlands. Thursday morning dawned, and once more the sun was shining. Our route lay along the Glen Kens Valley, following the course of the Water of Ken towards its source in the Carsfern Hills. A quick consultation of the map, and I determined to stick to the right-hand side of the valley, and we headed out through St. John's town of Dalry. Our route gave us brilliant views of Earlstoun and Carsford Locks, through which the river flows, both of which are dammed and produce hydroelectric power for the national grid. At Kendoon Lock, which is fed by the Ken and the water of Dure, our road continued along the waterside, now following the course of the Dure, with rolling hills on either side, and then we were climbing once more as the valley narrowed. We had soon reached the junction with the A713 and followed the sign for air. Once over the watershed, we headed through Dalmellington, entering the valley of the Doon, and were heading towards the coast once more. Before we knew it, we were on the A78 and eventually made our way to Ardrossan, with plenty of time to get the ferry to Arran. That night, we pitched our tent on a site near Brodick. We had another 62 miles in our legs, and were about to savour the taste of our first Scottish island. Tom must have been tired, but it didn't stop him exploring our immediate vicinity whilst I pitched the tent and wondered where the nearest pub was.